Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It is August 9th today, and I'm sitting down to talk about this weekend's upcoming solar eclipse in the sign of Leo. So, we've talked at length over the course of the summer months about this eclipse season, right? There's been three big eclipses back to back to back, all in a row. We've talked about each of them. So, the intention of today's talk is to take a look at this weekend's big solar eclipse in Leo and talk about how how we're distinguishing a little bit from the eclipses that we've had in Aquarius, the last one on July 27th that we had in Aquarius, and what you might expect from this particular new moon solar eclipse in the sign of the Lion. So that's what we'll be doing today. But before I dive into talking about the solar eclipse, there are two major transits happening today and in the course of the next week that are, fairly significant. So I'm going to talk about those two first. The first transit that's sort of rolling through in the next 24 hours is a square between Venus in Libra and Saturn in Capricorn. So we will get also to talking about Jupiter and Neptune. There's a trine forming right now between Jupiter and Neptune. And then finally, we will talk about the solar eclipse in Leo at length. So these first two will be sort of short, and then I'll spend more time with the solar eclipse in Leo. But okay, so Venus in Libra squaring Saturn in Capricorn. So let's talk about this particular transit, which has been building over the course of the week and is now perfecting. So first of all, let's talk about the nature of Venus and the nature of Saturn. Venus is a planet of love, friendship, beauty, art, harmony, performance, desire, sensuality, sexuality. It is a planet in nature that is related to hot and moist qualities or life-giving qualities. So Venus, like Jupiter, is called a benefic planet, the lesser benefic, but it is a planet that you could say in the plant kingdom is associated with the kinds of conditions necessary for things to grow or proliferate. So it confirms and it unifies and it makes things grow. Venus is also, most generally speaking, a planet that has a unique ability to bring unlike things together and harmonize them. So that's a little bit about Venus. She has two domains in the zodiac, places that we consider her home. One is Taurus and the other is Libra. So those are her two hangout spots. And then we have Saturn on the other hand. She's in Libra right now. She's in one of her home spots, her masculine air sign hangout. So, and then you've got Saturn. And Saturn is a planet that is associated with winter and qualities that are more dry and cold, and with decay and death in terms of the cycle of a plant, or the kinds of things that you see in nature throughout the seasons. Saturn associated with winter, death, decline, decay, old age, as well as time, and the tendency that all things have toward entropy, deterioration, disease, and the like. Saturn is also connected with wisdom, like a grandmother or a grandfather that has lived a long time, has experienced a lot, and also potentially seen a lot, had a lot of life lessons, and maybe very wise. So Saturn's sometimes connected with people who are hermetic or reclusive, or who like to hole up in their office and read a lot. That's definitely, I've got a moon in Saturn sign right in the 9th house of higher education. So I love sitting in my office and reading. I could do that all day long, right? But at any rate, people who like to spend long periods of time in isolation or solitude, time alone, those kinds of things associated with Saturn. Saturn associated with darkness, but also the mystery and, you might say, the magic of darkness. Saturn associated with things that are outcast, marginalized, sometimes stuck in the past, things that are strongly dogmatic, rigid, or highly structured, disciplined. So give you a little bit of a sense of Saturn. Well, Saturn has two hangout spots, two domains within the zodiac, Capricorn and Aquarius. Saturn also hanging out in its home domicile of Aquarius, or excuse me, Capricorn, which is its feminine earth sign. So we have a very feminine Saturn, very comfortable in its own hangout spot, and we have a more masculine Venus in her masculine dwelling place, getting together in a 90-degree square. Squares are of the nature of Mars. One way that you can tell this is by looking at one of the original teaching charts that ancient astrologers used, which was called the Thema Mundi. And the Thema Mundi shows us the nature of aspects by showing us that the planetary rulership distribution of the traditional 7 planets around the wheel sets up the which planets are associated with which aspects. So for example, when you go out to the left of the moon in the chart and the right of the sun, and you put the sun and moon sort of on the bottom of the chart, and imagine going to the right of the sun and the left of the moon, and you go to a square, you're going to get to the signs of, from the sun, it's going to be Scorpio, which is a Mars-ruled sign, and from the moon in Cancer, you're going to get to Aries, which is a Mars-ruled sign. So the squares are said to be of the nature of Mars. So what is Mars? You have to know a little bit about Mars to understand the aspects. Really, everything in ancient astrology breaks down to understanding the planetary dynamics, their core sort of actions really intimately, and knowing their sympathies and antipathies with one another. There's endless variation in astrology. Astrology is always able to reflect a huge myriad of things because there's a huge myriad of things happening in the world and a limited amount of symbols. So the language of essential dignity, how they act when they're in one sign versus another, has to do with different blendings of one planetary quality blending with or expressing itself through the lens of another. So when we talk about a square, you have to know something about the nature of Mars. Well, Mars is cutting and severing. Mars is penetrating and dividing. Mars is confrontational, aggressive, god of war. So we have a bit of a confrontational dynamic right now between Venus and Saturn. It's been perfecting all week, but it's going to perfect over the next 24 hours more intensely. Now, before I say what that might mean, let's add to this equation the fact that an astrological transit may produce the events more strongly in some charts than others based on what your individual birth chart looks like. And also, it doesn't always produce the same types of events for everybody. There's sort of an archetypal range of possibilities. And finally, it can happen at any point during a sort of umbrella time zone around the transit. So 3-4 days before Venus squares Saturn, you can feel it. 3-4 days afterward, you can feel it. Usually what I do as an astrologer is I will write about transits as they are perfecting in several different ways at several different instances, sort of highlighting different archetypal possibilities as you go, so that people can think about and sort of meditate on the transit. This way, when we're living our lives in relation to the astrology, it becomes a kind of moving meditation with the transit. It's not just an event that's happening to you, although it may concretize in terms of an event in your life or something happening inside or around you or in a relationship or something like that. But it's also important to continually meditate on the transit, that we enter into a kind of prayerful relationship with the transit, because these oracles are also transcendental objects for meditation. One of the ways that this was first exposed to me was during many years of drinking ayahuasca very regularly in several different groups and traditions. One thing that I perceived while studying astrology and being in the altered universe of ayahuasca land was that the planets are not only multidimensional sets of adjectives, right, where you can just use like Saturn is time or Saturn is age or discipline or whatever, which is how we tend to think about it, and we apply those adjectives to our experience to sort of make sense of them, or to use the sky as a mirror to understand our experiences. But the ayahuasca experience also showed me that these planets are also like temples. Like the signs, excuse me, are like temples in the sky, and the planets are like beautiful deities in the center, inner sanctum of the signs, you might say, and relating to them, having some ongoing prayerful mood, each of them becomes a kind of transparent conduit for understanding the workings of the divine, because each of the planets are sort of administrators of divine will and divine law and divine sentient relationship that is trying to be had with us at all times. So meditating on the transits from a variety of different standpoints over the course of the whole body of a transit is very important. But that's a sort of philosophical aside. What does Venus Saturn represent? It's perfecting today. What might you see or what might you experience? Well, Venus as love, relationships, harmony, etc., and Saturn as age, time, and commitment, you may see different kinds of relationships forming deeper commitments right now, though some of the ways in which the commitments in your life may be deepening, they could involve a little bit of conflict. It could involve some tension or some strain or some effort or some work. So you have to remember that the tension between the two, there's a kind of confrontational edge. Thankfully, Venus in Libra is the sign of Saturn's exaltation. So there's a natural love and respect that Libra has, you might say, for Saturn. Saturn is like a patron, has its own patron deity shrine within the home of Libra. There's a separate wing in the temple of Libra just totally devoted to Saturn because it's the place of Saturn's exaltation. So Venus in Libra is actually very respectful of Saturn, and so the square is about Venus, perhaps, for example, in Saturn's exaltation, is about the expectations that we have of one another in relationships and how those expectations are being asked to mature or grow or evolve or step up or become more mature in some way. So you can think right now of the tension in relationships being related to the idea that there's a desire for commitments to grow stronger or firmer or more serious. And there's an elevated standard, kind of a mood of higher expectations for relationships that you could possibly see right now. So that's one thing to consider. Now, the other thing that goes along with that is that there's a bitter and a sweet. Saturn often related to kind of things that are more bitter to experience. Venus related to things that are more sweet. And so there's also the feeling of things being bittersweet, of things that are ripening and possibly being let go of, or things that you may be reluctant to give up or to see change. But there's also a sweetness, a knowing that the new opportunity presenting itself is good. And so there's the combination of having to let go, say goodbye, grow up, mature, get more serious, because there's something also some beautiful opportunity or some moment of greater harmony available to you right now. That combination may create a mood of something being bitter and sweet. You also think of Venus and Saturn, you think of things that age like a fine wine. Things that are really beautiful in life take time. And if compromise, okay, so how is this? I'll give you an example. Someone that I work with that I really respect their work a lot. Recently, they've gotten busier, and I pay them for a service every year. And they've recently gotten much busier in their work and basically said, I can't work for you this year. And I thought about it and I thought, oh, this is so bittersweet, you know? But then I meditated on it a little bit more and I thought, they're getting busier. Their work is getting more successful. And I think they don't want to ask for more pay potentially, because we're friends. And so they've given me sort of a reduced rate. And so the feeling of this relationship needs to mature. I need to reach out and meet this person where they are at and recognize the growth that they've done and think of a new kind of bond, a new kind of agreement or understanding that we can have in our business relationship. And so I reached out and I said, you know what, your work is amazing to me and it's really worth a lot to me. So how about I pay you competitively with your other work right now so that I can still have you around? Instantly, yeah, let's do it. You know what I mean? So, but that's a real Venus Saturn moment. That was a perfect example of Venus and Saturn perfecting in my, like in my own chart, right? So, and where is Venus in my birth chart? It's in the 6th house, which is a house of people that I employ, right? And it was for a 9th house matter, something connected to astrology and the spiritual work that I do in the world, Saturn in the 9th. So the relationship with someone that I employ, Venus in the 6th, just had to mature and grow a little bit more committed and firm and serious. And I could have lost it if I had just said, if I had said like, oh my gosh, they're not going to work with me anymore. They don't value me. They don't, you know what I mean? Like if I had camped out in Saturn territory, let's say, and just gotten really like rigid about my expectations and not flipped over to the Venus side and said, hey, look at their expectations are increasing and I see the value in their work, right? And so the Venus being in Saturn's exaltation really helps right now because there's an aura of grace that's there for us to see where compromises are possible and even fruitful. On the other hand, it's very possible for this exact dynamic to turn into calcifications in relationships. Well, your expectations are too much or too high, or my expectations aren't being met here, or for there to be kind of like lines drawn in the sand where it's kind of more like Saturn saying, meet my bar up here or you get nothing. Or on the other hand, you could have Venus in a sense just asking for too much and not having good boundaries or a good sense of what Saturn requires, which is generally more maturity. So the other thing is that pain and love go together. So we don't like this, but the truth is, if you're a gardener, for example, then there's you know this very well. What do they say that the best thing is for the flowers or plants in your garden? One of my teachers said this recently. It's the shade of the gardener's the shade of the gardener's shadow. The shade of the gardener's shadow. What does that mean? It means, we'd probably all agree, that the gardener has to be involved often and regularly. But you know what? In this world, familiarity breeds contempt. It's a truth. It's a very basic truth. Whatever we do often and regularly, we get tired of, we get sick of, we want something different. We want something novel. We want to wed ourselves and our interest and our attention to something different or something new. There definitely is a phrase. One of my Jewish friends told me this when I was living in New York. He said, there's a saying in my family, and he said, I feel that it's a very Jewish saying. This was him joking around back then, and I've just never forgotten it. But I think you could say it's a Dutch saying as well, my own family background. But he said, love me little, fine, just love me long. Love me little, but love me long. Meaning, he said, in my family, affection and romance is downplayed in terms of longevity and commitment and time. And that's just it was part of him joking about his tradition. I was like, oh, it really is not so far from what I've seen in my own Dutch upbringing in Michigan. A lot of my relatives have that same mood about love and marriage and commitments and things like that. Like, just be committed over a long period of time, even if it's just horrible. Sometimes there's too much of that in the world, and that's a problem. And this transit could easily represent that feeling of there being false pride taken in commitments done for the sake of commitment. Like people who say, well, everyone in my family's been married for, and nobody's been divorced. It's like, yeah, well, they're all having affairs and they're miserable. You know what I mean? There's no pride in that. But on the other hand, there is something about, like I said, about the gardener living in the shade of the plants do best when they live in the shade of the gardener. Love takes tending, relationships take tending, and there are natural contractive moments and cycles of great crisis, in the life of any kind of relationship. And yet those are the moments where we learn to tend something. We learn to be close to something. You don't know how to garden, really. And my wife has told me this before too. She's a gardener and an herbalist. You don't know how to garden unless there is a committed, there are committed moments of having to fret and worry about things that could be dying, might not make it. And you learn a lot about how to make it through hard or difficult times by being flexible, by adapting, by dealing with things when they're in stressful conditions. Venus Saturn is also, in some ways, represents the intangible quality of depth and intimacy that is forged in any kind of relationship or anything that we do in our lives through those kinds of crises and contractive dynamics. You can't really develop a sense of confidentiality or the need or importance of confidentiality, for example, without something that is sacred and vulnerable and potentially harming someone, or could harm someone or something. So that confidentiality is very similar to intimacy in that regard. In fact, one of my favorite literary figures, Derrida, when I was in grad school, I loved Derrida. He's a sort of deconstructionist, postmodern type of guy. And he was a really interesting character. And I really enjoyed reading his different philosophical treatises on literature and literary theory. And he was interviewed one time about his relationship with his wife in a documentary film that was made about his life. And there was this moment where they were sitting there and he said, "Tell us about how you first met, and when did you first start falling in love?" And they looked at each other and they had this long moment of looking at each other. And in that exchange, there was sweetness, and then there was like humor, like a dark humor, and then there was a hardness. And it just went through so many phases, just looking at them over the course of like 15 seconds as they looked at each other. And then Derrida turned to the camera and said something like, "It's an impossible confidence. It's an impossible confidentiality. It's an impossible thing. It's too vulnerable and beautiful to share." And I in some ways he's a really dramatic sort of like literary guy or whatever, but I just love that line. And that's a very Venus Saturn line. Things in life that are good and beautiful and deep and meaningful, like a fine wine, they take a long time and many contractive death processes that they go through to become something rich and beautiful. So that's also in the air right now. Now, the other possibility is for withholding things. Saturn and Venus is notorious at withholding love. In fact, one of the main natal significations of Saturn and Venus, let's say hanging out in your 7th house of love or something like that, or Saturn and Venus anywhere in your natal chart, can be, an astrologer may read that as the person having troubles in love, or not marrying easily, or being single, or the idea of love being withheld. That can be a Venus Saturn kind of thing. Oh, now I've told you that there are some instances where there can be a very beautiful Saturn Venus kind of expression of the maturity of love, time, age, commitment, wisdom, and love. But there's also withholding love. And so how and why do we withhold things from others? And how is a strategy of withholding potentially a part of the way that we're managing a situation, or someone else is managing a situation with us? Oftentimes, the ugliest kinds of relationships are those in which a person displays love through giving and displays dissatisfaction through withholding. And those dynamics are sort of in the air right now as well. Vain or false gestures, diplomatic offerings that are underhanded or ultimately selfish. You have to be careful of those kinds of things right now. Triangulation dynamics, especially with Libra, who's always got Venus and Libra, got the scales balancing back and forth. And with Saturn, there's a lot of tendency for Venus and Libra to get into triangulation situations where you try to pit people against one another, or you try to elevate yourself by taking a stance. Try to elevate yourself in the eyes of one person by taking a stance comparative to their own about a third person. You know what I mean? These kinds of triangulating dynamics, and using them as a sort of Machiavellian way. You have to be very careful of that right now. Another potential in the air. Hard lines and stark images of beauty. Beauty is also wintry. Venus in Libra is an autumnal sign. Saturn Capricorn is a winter sign, first sign of winter. So there's also wintry, icy, colder love. The image of a barren, wintry landscape. The hard, Librans, people who are Libra rising or Venus in Libra or whatever, often are people who, they love blacks and whites, right? They love the combination between black and white. But they also, with being the exaltation of Saturn, they love things that look hard and old or sturdy. So hard lines, beautiful, sturdy architecture, but very clean, sort of pristine contrasts between black and white or gray. These kinds of, you may just notice the aesthetic of Venus, Saturn sort of in the air right now. But Saturn's demand for Venus is that she get a little bit earthier. Saturn in Capricorn is much more organic, much more connected to, the beauty of things. I'll give you an example. This morning, I was out on my morning walk. I was chanting and walking my dog, and the sun was just coming up, and I walked past our garden, the fence along the street. On the other side of the fence is our garden. So I was walking past and looking over into our garden, and it's been really, really hot here. And my wife's obviously pregnant, so the flower or the herbal garden has been a little neglected because I'm not a great gardener. So I just was like, I need to give it some water. So you could see this is August, things are starting to dry out, etc. So there was a dryness and kind of like the deterioration, the death. You could see it setting in on this. I don't know what it was. It might have been echinacea or something. Anyway, so it was like collapsing also beneath the weight. And, as it was collapsing, it was looking like dead. But then hovering right in the midst of the flowers that were leaning over and falling was a hummingbird. And it was like iridescent, and the noise that it was making was like, sounds like a buzzing, like a very loud buzzing, its wings going so fast. So I was looking at that, and I was like, wow, it's such a Venus-Saturn image. There's this very beautiful thing set among something that's beautiful but dying. It was very, I was just reflecting on the astrology. That's a very Venus-Saturn kind of image. So at any rate, the last thing to think about with Venus-Saturn over the next 24 hours is the ideal and falling short of the ideal. There's a great sense of expectation and idealism built into Libra. Venus in Libra doesn't just love. Venus in Libra sometimes has very high and sometimes rather inhuman or abstract kinds of expectations for beauty, hygiene, the look or feel of something. And Saturn may be trying to also check Venus back into reality, saying, yes, I too like the ideal, but, Saturn hanging out in Capricorn, much earthier. And again, I've said this many times before, but the earth is uneven. Libra likes the balance, but the earth you walk on is uneven on your feet, and your feet need to know that unevenness in order to feel a kind of tangible sense of peace and acceptance. So Venus in Libra sometimes struggles with that, and there can also be a sense of needing to check our expectations against a more earthy or realistic reality. Okay, so next transit, Jupiter and Neptune are getting together in the next week in a trine in water signs, Jupiter in Scorpio, Neptune in Pisces. So with Jupiter and Neptune in water signs, you think of prolific, life-giving, supportive, developmental, and affirming themes. Okay, because with water, you are talking about all three of the water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, being traditionally called prolific or fertile. What does that mean? It means in support of life, or it means the potential for life and the conditions for life are ripe. Obviously, we don't have life without water on this planet. We know that. And whenever they talk about going to other planets and looking for signs of life, they say, we found water, so that's a good likelihood that there is some life here. So with Jupiter, a planet that's very abundant, right, and Neptune, a planet that's related to the oceans and to water, both in water signs connecting by a trine. And what are trines? They are of the nature of Jupiter. We can see this in the Thema Mundi again, because we look at the trines from the moon out to the left and the sun out to the right. Again, put them on the bottom of the chart. Go out to the left of Cancer and the moon until you get to Pisces, and that's a Jupiter-ruled sign traditionally. Go to the right of the sun out to Sagittarius for the first trine, and that's a Jupiter-ruled sign. So ancient astrologers said trine is of the nature of Jupiter. So you have a Jupiter, you have water, you have Jupiter, a planet of abundance, confirmation, affirmation, growth, coherence, making things larger or bigger. And then you have the trine to the god of the oceans in a water sign, Pisces, also the sign of Jupiter, and in a trine which is of the nature of Jupiter. So that's like a ton of water. That's a ton of life-giving, affirming, supportive, growth-oriented conditions. And so you, just like Venus and Saturn, you should check your birth chart and see where Libra and Capricorn are to understand maybe the topics specifically related to that transit in your birth chart. One of the great things you can do is look at your birth chart and go, okay, where's Pisces and Scorpio? And think to yourself, there's just a lot of rain hitting the ground in those places in my life right now. And so there's life-giving, fertile, growth-oriented qualities associated with this transit, just big time. For example, when you go back to the Jupiter Neptune trines in the past, and especially in there was the doping scandal with the, I want to say it was something to do with the Winter Olympics and the Russian team. And this came out the last time that Jupiter and Neptune got into a trine with one another in Pisces and Scorpio. So the possibility for things to grow, great. But the possibility for things to become excessively growth-oriented is also there. It's very easy, because we're used to this being in the air right now, to just sort of assume that growth will endure forever, that things will keep growing. If you've been hitting a cycle of growth, or lots of people coming into your life, or lots of job opportunities, or, you know, whatever it's been, lots of anything, it can eventually lead to hubris, because we think to ourselves, well, the tide will never go back out. You know what I mean? The waters come in, but we become deluded into thinking that it'll never go out again. And that happens. As much as familiarity breeds contempt, success also breeds forgetting. Success and growth often, just like summer, you know, I've been listening a lot to songs about summer, because we just named our daughter Summer. Well, one of the songs that I was listening to the other day was talking about, you know, dreams in the summer. And I was just sitting there and I was like, yeah, it is such a dreamy time, because everything, there's so much life and rain and growth and wetness and heat, and everything's so prolific that you fall asleep. That's what happens with Jupiter and Neptune. They're both planets that can easily delude us into thinking that the conditions of abundance will just last forever. But no, things contract and eventually go back out. All of this is not to say that this is a contractive moment. It's to say, don't fall asleep, in a sense, with the Jupiter-Neptune environment. It's very easy to become deluded, hazy, foggy, puffed up, prideful. It's easy to bite off more than we can chew, to overdo things. It's also easy to be deluded into fast solutions to progress or growth, financial schemes, or drugs or substances. And we think, oh, if I just eat a bunch of this or do a bunch of that or whatever. You know, one of the things one of my teachers says is, like, you can't fool God. You know what I mean? This universe, whatever you'd like, however you like to call it, the divine intelligence is not fooled by our attempts at shortcuts. You know what I mean? The only real ability to grow and go where we want to in spiritual life is in the sincerity of our heart. And if anything that we're doing is based on the desire to try and not fully surrender, try to get around the surrendering part. This will get me there quick, or something like that, spiritually or materially. Both are forms of cheating that have karmic lessons associated with them. So we should be really careful about that. I remember, for example, when I was first in the Amazon drinking ayahuasca, I'll never forget, after some of my first ceremonies, I was sitting down with this one guy, and he was just like over the moon elated about ayahuasca, as I was, as were most people, because this was 2003, 2004. So well before the massive rush popularization of ayahuasca. I was sort of earlier in the process of getting on board with it, and there was a lot of buzz. It was just, the buzz was like just starting to really grow. It had been there for a while, people like Terence McKenna and so forth, but I was sitting there in one of the lodges talking to him about our experiences in ceremony, and he looked at me and he was like, "It's like a shortcut, man." He like whispered, literally, "It's like a shortcut, man." And I remember hearing him say that and going, don't think so. I mean, I said at the time, I go, "It's really hard work. Ayahuasca is really hard work." And he was like, "Yeah, but you can get it all done in like 6 hours." And I was like, I don't think so. And 10 years later, I can tell you that I still feel the same way. It's not a shortcut. There's no shortcuts. There are no shortcuts. The progress that you make in any area of life, materially speaking, if you associate your progress with material results, those material results are always prone to deterioration, to falling apart, for regression to occur, etc. Eventually, I think it was Allen Ginsberg, or Alan Watts, who said, or maybe it was Timothy Leary or someone said, if you get the message, hang up the phone. And I found that was true in the ayahuasca world as well, that the people that I saw doing the best with ayahuasca, over time, whatever work they did, whatever healing they achieved, the message became stronger and stronger, that if you don't take these realizations and turn them into daily lived practices, they will disappear. The progress will disappear. The weeds will grow back. Look at nature and just see that if you leave anything sitting for a while, nature will generally just come in and consume it. You know what I mean? So the natural tendency that life has in the material world is to keep growing, for things to just keep coming in and keep growing and keep growing and keep growing. So weirdly, with Jupiter and Neptune, there is a tendency to think, like I can, that we mistake growth for spiritual development or evolution. Growth is not always the same as spiritual evolution, because spiritual evolution, in a sense, is beyond the cycles of growth and deterioration. It includes both. It goes through both. And so we have to be very careful not to confuse opportunities for growth and advancement on any level right now with spiritual growth. It's not always the same. There aren't shortcuts in spiritual growth. Even if something can accelerate you rapidly in some way, anything that you try to use has a shelf life. Anything that you try to use or take or consume or aid you or help you, the thing that we're really trying to access is in the heart and in the soul. And to do that, we can do that in lots of different ways. There's lots of things that can help us, but we can't mistake cheap fixes or fast acting solutions as very easy to do with a Jupiter-Neptune trine, just like a major case in the news, a doping scandal. Trying to get too big too fast, you get busted for it eventually. So you have to be careful of that. Now, on the other hand, there is, of course, there is a long history of spiritual technologies being used for the sake of healing and growth and things like that. And I am certainly not trying to hate on those, you know what I mean? So even in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, when Krishna is talking about all of the different forms of God, Krishna says, "I am the healing herb." So there is a place and space for all different kinds of technologies that may aid or assist us in life. You just have to be careful of the Superman tendency that can come in, so to speak, with Jupiter and Neptune. So, prolific, life-giving, supportive, developmental, affirming, potentially too much growth, excessiveness, the idea that you can take a shortcut, that you can ride a high forever, and not recognizing that the real eternal source of happiness is able to be accessed through cycles of both growth and expansion as well as contraction in this material world. Also, teachers and students, it's a very good moment to find your teacher or to find a sage or to naturally find a good fit with a teacher, a style of learning, something like that. Jupiter and Neptune both have associations with mysticism, teachers, philosophy, altered states of consciousness, spirituality, religion, faith. Of course, with Jupiter, Neptune, you also it may be a very good time to find a teacher, or for teachers to find students and students to find teachers. But there may also be a sense in which you can, again, think to yourself, overestimate the worth of something, or potentially think, well, sort of the guru complex. You can think, sort of think too highly about your own knowledge or your own expertise or your own realization or whatever, or overestimate the realizations of others. It's an easy time to be deluded with Jupiter and Scorpio by the dark guru. And I don't mean to, I don't want to, be controversial here, but there was a documentary that was released, and I thought it was interesting that it's really become popular as Jupiter's entered Scorpio, and that's called Wild Country, and it's about the followers of Osho, and about Osho, if you guys know who Osho is. And I watched the whole thing, and I was really shocked because I really didn't know anything about this particular spiritual teacher, and it's a perfect example of Jupiter, Neptune, and Jupiter and Scorpio and things like that, in terms of the level of corruption, darkness, materialism, and all different kinds of things that were operating under the surface of a sort of spiritual community. So that's also possible during Jupiter and Neptune's trine to one another, that you be careful of not getting deluded into things that glimmer and are filled with glamour, and potentially even spiritual glamour, but substantively are not, there's some level of hypocrisy or greed or consuming hunger or desire that's really driving someone or something beneath the surface. Also, I mentioned magical or remedial efforts. This is also a really important thing in general, because right now in the astrology world, I just had a guest a few nights ago who's talking about Vedic astrology, and Austin Kopek just has a book out about astrological magic. And there's, I've had students asking me questions about this and so forth. How do you feel about astrological magic, like talismans, or say in India you have a difficult Venus or Saturn, you might wear a certain kind of gemstone or repeat certain kind of mantras for remediation of certain kinds of afflictions or what have you. How do you feel about, someone asked me, like, how do you feel about that? And I was like, well, I'm of two minds of it. And this is relevant for Jupiter Neptune, because Jupiter Neptune can easily refer to things like magic, shamanism, altered states of consciousness, psychedelics, etc. I was like, well, I'm of two minds of it, because again, 10 years of my life was consumed with drinking one of the world's most powerful psychedelic plant medicines in a very spiritual setting, and seeing the light and dark side of that, right? So I have a lot of personal experience to draw on. And so the way that I've answered that question, in short, has been, there are certain ways, whether it's pujas in India, or gemstones in India, reciting mantras to planetary deities, or whether it's, hermetic talismanic magic from Egypt or whatever, or shamanism from the Amazon. There are technologies that are available to help people release different kinds of patterns and baggage and karma, and they're real. And anyone who thinks that they aren't real just hasn't experienced them. And anyone who thinks that they're just a product of your mind or imagination also, in my view, just hasn't experienced them. So I think I, first of all, validate them as very real. But on the other hand, there's always been a stigma within different religious and spiritual traditions that basically says that you shouldn't play with fire, that there's that kind of idea, you shouldn't play with fire. And I also actually, I think it's possible to be of two minds of this subject, because I also take that stance of you shouldn't play with fire. Not everybody knows how to use these technologies. One of the things that my guest Moses Sirigar said the other night when he was talking is he said, working with gemstones, very popular in the West, but in India, it's considered very dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. And similarly, after 10 years in the ayahuasca world, I don't have nearly the same cavalier attitude about ceremonial or ritualistic use of entheogens or psychedelics as I did when I first started, because I've seen people damaged or harmed by not using them appropriately, or not knowing what they're doing, or treating them in a way that is glorifying the technology rather than the source of the technology, which I think is the key issue for me. I think, herbalism, my wife practices herbalism. She's very conscious about working with the spirits of the plants and things like that. I think all of that is very beautiful, as I do anybody who is reverentially using different forms of ceremonial, spiritual ceremonial rites or what have you. But I will say that for me, it's been very important. The ayahuasca over 10 years gradually showed me that the power of the plants come from the divine. And that if the main practice in our life is not about watering the roots of the spiritual tree, which means loving the divine, this is, my own faith speaking, if that isn't the first priority, the tree will wither and die. The tree of our spiritual life will wither and die. It will become corrupt, and it will deliver results that are often far more dangerous in some ways than people who aren't doing anything spiritual. And the reason for this is that if we're constantly focused on remedial technologies to help alleviate different kinds of suffering or pain or difficulties in the world, but we're not recognizing the most basic solution, which is surrendering our hearts to the divine. If that's not, then we're not watering the roots of the tree will die, because what we're doing is we're watering branches. It's like if I pour water on the branches of a tree outside, I don't get down to the roots, right, of a baby tree or something like that, it won't grow. So my own faith view when it comes to different forms of magic or remediation and astrology or what have you is fine, as long as you're doing it with an understanding that any and every technology that would be some form of, let's say, white magic or something that's meant to aid you positively in your spiritual cultivation of the good virtues in life, patience, peace, kindness, tolerance, compassion, etc. You're using something to help you with that, fine. But if you're not recognizing the source of power and beauty and divinity that is within any of the technologies, if you're not watering the roots of the tree, you can get in real trouble. So that's how I deal with that, but everyone feels a little bit differently. I thought I would share that because I've actually gotten a lot of questions about that, and it's a very appropriate topic given that the Jupiter-Neptune trine is often specifically related to the use of things like magic or ceremonial rituals designed to alter consciousness or things like that. So there's also a thing with Neptune and Jupiter. Traditionally, I went back in a previous lecture that I gave at one time, and I talked about how Jupiter-Neptune also has a history of religious intolerance and issues of purity. So Jupiter-Neptune is also about what proliferates and what's popular and strong and like that. But it's also the desire of Jupiter and Neptune to make a complete whole and unify everything almost monistically into a oneness that lacks diversity and difference. That can lead to different kinds of intolerance, different kinds of, you know, different kinds of impatience and intolerance, or issues saying, well, this is pure and that's not pure, things like that, especially in water sign. So the basic thing to think about right now is, like someone who's trying to get as big as they can on steroids, right? It's possible for your beliefs or your convictions right now, your philosophical, political, sentiments, to get so intense and so strong that you want to reduce everything into a singular focus, a singular vision. And even though it sounds like a very lovely, it's a trine. It's a trine between two planets and water signs. It's Jupiter and Neptune. Oh my gosh, how lovely. But the shadow of that desire to make everything so cohesive and big and unified and grand and fluid and everything like that is intolerance for diversity. That's always the shadow of oneness. And this is one of the reasons why the particular spiritual philosophy that I embrace is not about oneness. It's for in Sanskrit, the name for part of the theological philosophy that I embrace in the practice of Bhakti Yoga is Achinta Beta Beta, which means simultaneous, inconceivable simultaneous oneness and difference. So, for example, it would be something like saying, as spirit souls, we are all part and parcel of God or the divine, and yet we are fundamentally separate and different from. So you could think about it like in oneness philosophy, you say, you're having an illusion that you're separate from God when really you are God, and you're going to go back and merge with God. This philosophy is more like, no, you're always an eternally individual, divine agent. You're made of the same stuff of God, but you're individual, like a spark is to a fire. The fire and the spark are of the exact same nature and essence, but the spark is one part of the larger whole and retains its own unique autonomy and agency, which is necessary for the cultivation of intimacy between the spark and the fire. So that philosophy is what I personally embrace. And one of the reasons that I personally embrace that philosophy or that theology over time is that I have found more monistic philosophies to breed intolerance. And so anything could breed intolerance, obviously, but that's been my experience, is that the more monistic oneness-based philosophies without some room for difference, simultaneous difference and diversity, have been a really big turnoff for me. Okay, so I'm using this as an anecdote. Believe that or not believe it, whatever, wherever you stand is cool. But be careful of the desire to make everything one, and it to the detriment potentially of some diversity. Okay. The other thing you have to be careful about is that water spreads things. Water spreads things. So, for example, if I turn to, I usually check in on CNN every day. I check in on CNN, and one of the things that is right, where is it? Contaminated food kills 9 people at a funeral. That's, first of all, that is like the most depressing. Like, that is just like an awful, that's like, so you can't make that up. It's like something from a bad, like, horror movie or something. Like, what an awful situation. But that is actually very, very spot on with Jupiter in a Mars-ruled Scorpio sign and Neptune in Pisces. The potential spread of infectious things. So be very careful guarding your sort of subtle body, your emotional body, your energy body, because things can have a very deep and powerful, overwhelming impression right now. Immunity can be compromised. Just the potential for spreading things that are good or bad potentially. So also think about that with water. And then you want to think about what you're opening yourself to or what you're being opened to, which may be good or, again, not so good. All right, so we've gotten through the Venus-Saturn is we mentioned, that's today and tomorrow. Jupiter, Neptune over the course of the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, because it's going to take a while. It's going to be within a close few degrees of a trine to Neptune for the next few weeks. So last but not least, solar eclipse in Leo. All right. So this eclipse is coming on Saturday, and it's a big eclipse because it's the last eclipse of the Aquarius Leo nodal period. The nodes are going to change signs in November into Capricorn and Cancer. And so they change signs. That means the eclipses are going to be landing in Cancer and Capricorn for the next year and a half or so. We already had our first one on like July 12th with the big eclipse in with opposite Pluto. So it was in Cancer on July 12th, and it was opposite Pluto in Capricorn. But we're going to start getting eclipses in Cancer, Capricorn in November. So that's coming really soon. But this means it's the last eclipse of the Aquarius Leo nodal period. So there's a kind of a culmination happening with these eclipses. Eclipses come in waves, in like sets of waves if you're a surfer or something like that. So the Leo and Aquarius eclipses have been happening since, winter of 2017, late 2016 type of situation. So we have been in them for a while, and that means that there's a culmination occurring in terms of the kinds of transformations that have been happening in your life due to the eclipses falling in these signs over and over and over and over again. So it's a chapter that's sort of concluding a transformational focus in the areas of Leo and Aquarius that's finishing. So easiest thing to do is check your birth chart. Where's Leo? Where's Aquarius? What are the whole sign houses? Or you can look at, if you use quadrant-based houses like Placidus or something like that, for this one, look at the 18th degree of Leo. Just like for the July 27th, you would have been looking at the about 4th degree of Aquarius. So, but look at the houses that, and look at the topics associated with the houses in your chart to see where things have been changing. For example, in my chart, whole sign 10th house is Aquarius, whole sign 4th house is Leo. So career and home and family stuff. Well, over this period of time, I've been slowly making some pretty significant changes to my offerings, specifically this YouTube channel, and also welcoming a new little soul into our family who was just born. So all of those things have been some of the primary focus: 10th house career, 4th house home and family. All of that's sort of coming to a close now as the baby is here, sort of YouTube channel sort of established and kind of, on its own momentum now. So the shift, there's going to be a shift in focus now moving into Capricorn and Cancer, a new set of topics that are going to start to become emphasized, transformation starting to occur in new areas in life. So that's just an example from my own chart, but look at your chart and see where they've been happening and think to yourself, okay, culmination, completion, closure of the overall topics associated with these houses. But then more specifically, a solar eclipse is a new beginning. So you're thinking of yet another little seed that's being planted for future growth and changes to occur in the Leo-ruled area of your chart, specifically around the 18th degree. Look at planets that are closely conjoined to the 18th degree, or square or opposed, if you like, to that degree. If it's closely conjoined, an angle in your chart, like the ascendant, descendant, midheaven, or IC, if it's in an angular house, those kinds of things, which I've mentioned in previous talks, can be important. But then, generally speaking, let's talk about the Aquarius-Leo axis in general. Aquarius, a Saturn-ruled sign. Leo, the sun's sign. And so with Leo and Aquarius, we're thinking about ways in which we want to stand out, ways in which we want to be seen and want to be seen as unique and special and talented. It's about the pride that we have as a being that has an ego in this world, and also a deeper sense of a divine purpose or a sense of calling or destiny, all sun-related themes, as well as changes related to our sense of why we're here in a much deeper and spiritual way. So Leo and the sun also related to the sense of being here for transcendent purposes, spiritual purposes, for the sake of enlightenment, which is related to the sun as well. Excuse me. And then you have Saturn and Aquarius, which is in many ways related to not just how we are select and unique and special, or maybe even popular or visible or famous, but in what ways are we intrinsically different from outside of the status quo? How are we an outsider? How are we marginalized? These are all things that Saturn represents. How are we, Saturn, the dim, distant one, on the outskirts between the visible and the invisible? How are we doing something that's marginal, that's different? How are we curbing the desire of the ego for its name and fame and so forth, and instead emphasizing what we need to be doing with our life that may be a little bit more progressive, a little bit outside of the status quo, a little bit more risky, that we have to be somewhat dissociated from, the inner warmth of normalcy. We have to go into the cold reaches of being a loner, being a maverick, leaving the herd. So those two tensions have been very strong over the course of the eclipses falling in these signs since, late 2016, early 2017. So that's a balancing act, because if you go too far in one direction or the other, something gets lost. So if you go too far toward being an outsider, you don't know how to you don't know how to be liked, and how to you don't know how to fit in. You don't know how to be you don't care enough about the appeal of your ego, yourself, your personality in the world. You will easily you will easily frustrate other people or turn other people off, and whatever your progressive message may be, you won't be able to reach them. So oftentimes people who have really progressive things to say are too angry to reach other people, or they're too self-righteous to reach other people. They don't know how to compromise their ideals or their beliefs, because they stand counterculturally. That we say, I'm counter to culture. And so the Leo, on the other hand, is usually a little bit better at being liked. And so, balancing those two things is important. I think the first time I ever heard that explained was from Stephen Forrest. And it's always stuck with me as something that just seems so true, and so important. And I've got that nodal axis in my own charts. This is a nodal return for me in Aquarius and Leo. So I've been thinking about those themes a lot over the past couple of years. Anyway, so those themes can be, intense right now in general, but then add to the Leo eclipse in particular. What do we get with the Leo eclipse? Lessons about the ego, how we are special, how we stand out, how we are unique, how we are select from the city. So one thing that Robert Schmidt used to say was that the moon in ancient astrology and even in horary can represent the general populace, the voters, the city and its teeming life, the family, the ecosystem, the environment. The moon is the many, but the sun is the one. So the sun's question in Leo is often, how am I select from within the city? How am I select from within the family? Right? Like that. So, but you can't, there's a very strong need for that selectness to be recognized within the city. So there's a dynamism between the sun and the moon inherent within Leo. Just like a child wants to be different from their parents, but they also need the respect and admiration and recognition of their parents as they individuate. This is like Leo as well. So that's a solar kind of mission that we're on right now with this eclipse. Being ourselves, however, on a sort of spiritual level, what does that look like? Well, because this eclipse can easily emphasize things that are ultimately pretty egotistical if we don't ask any questions about what a spiritualized sort of Leo eclipse might look like. So here's some ideas to think about. Being ourselves means being a servant of the whole. So back to that spark and fire analogy that I used earlier. When we recognize that we are a part of the divine whole, the question about how we are select is no longer about how can I stand out and be liked and loved and get stuff, but rather it's about who am I really? And in understanding who we are in essence as a spiritual being, as an eternal spirit soul that's part of the whole, we discover our eternal dharma, our eternal duty, our eternal sense of what we are here to give or to be. And when we are that, we become effulgent. You see in the pictures of saints in the Catholic tradition and in the Indian tradition, you often see great halos surrounding the heads of saints, just like a lion has a kind of great halo surrounding it. But that halo is not a marker of fame. It's a marker of having stepped into and embodied your spiritual essence. And that's the same thing that Carl Jung had in mind when he was talking about individuation in a sense. So when we find what we really are as a divine, unique being, it's not always flashy or famous or special in the way that the world tells us to be special, but rather it's about knowing that what we're doing and who we're being in the heart is truly in alignment with our spiritual self. And it's ultimately the fruit of that is service to the whole. And so in service to the whole, we become effulgent. We start glowing like the sun. There's like an effulgence that surrounds us. Leo eclipses, especially a solar eclipse, which is kind of a planting a new seed, offers us an opportunity to step into that self more and to start glowing more with the natural beauty of who we are, which doesn't strive, it doesn't try, it doesn't take, it doesn't consume, it doesn't demand. It's not a narcissist. You know what I mean? So that's that. We have to think about what's the opportunity here to become more of my essential spiritual nature. Here's a mistake that most people make in my experience, in especially my own experience, when we're trying to become more of our spiritual selves, is we say, I'm going to become more of my spiritual self by doing something for number one. And we can actually try to justify this spiritually, like people who are like, yeah, I need to start claiming my power more, you know, or like I need to step into my awesomeness more, or something like that. And as soon as you hear that, as soon as someone, we don't want to be like people who live in fear, or people who, none of us want to cower toward the idea that we are worthless, or that we aren't created in the image of the divine, we aren't a piece of the divine ourselves. Nobody should live in that kind of fear or self-loathing or anything like that. But the cure is not to go to the opposite extreme and start thinking that you are God. You know what I mean? That you are Zeus or whatever, or that I am. This is something that I notice that New Age culture tends to indulge us in a lot, and it's part of a sales gimmick. It's part of the consumerism of New Age to sell you on, I can make you feel better about yourself, or do this thing and claim your power and be more awesome, you know, whatever, and you know, feed yourself a little of this ego stroking with the verbiage of spirituality, and you'll feel better. And actually what this does over time is it sets us up for one of two things. One, either very deep disappointment and disillusionment with spiritual things, because anything we try to root our sense of divinity in, that's all about gaining something in the material world that falls apart, will then come back and have us doubting spiritual things. We didn't understand that thing that was offered to us wasn't actually spiritual. It was material in the guise of spirituality. So you can lose your faith, and that's a dangerous thing to do. So that's the one thing you have to be really careful of. But the other thing that can happen is when we feed ourselves this line about being powerful and more powerful and whatever, what tends to happen is we start engendering a culture of crisis. Because what happens is when people lose their power, rather than becoming disillusioned and losing their faith, they think to themselves, see, that's just a deeper layer of my self-doubt, so I need to power up even more, right? And then it becomes about crisis averted, I gained my confidence back. So it engenders this cycling of like, I lost my power, but now I've got it back. I lost my power, but now I've got it back. Same thing when I was in the Christian church as a kid. My father was very critical of the culture in evangelical religion. My church that I grew up in, United Methodist, was evangelical, but not, say, to the extent that you might see a Southern Baptist being evangelical. Okay. One of the things that my father preached openly about from the pulpit was that, in some of these evangelical churches, people are being taught that having a Christian experience means feeling self-righteous and pumped up about your self-righteousness and pumped up about being sort of a perfect Christian or something like that. And then when you fall or fail or something happens, to get that feeling back, you have to have this totally cathartic collapse upon the altar and get rebaptized the next week. So they would have, and I went because I attended a Baptist school and a Baptist church for a while, and I would see this week in and week out where people would come up for an altar call the very next week and just like, I need to be baptized like all over again. Let's do this all over again because I need to feel high and up on my so sort of self-righteous kick. The New Age can promote the exact same thing. When we think about empowering ourselves and we associate that with like, yeah, I'm finally going to quit my job and tell my boss off, and then I'm going to start my own Reiki practice, and I'm going to, I can't tell you, I mean, probably at least 100 clients a year I see are considering the difficulty or struggles that they're having in their life that are very real, and I can totally sympathize with. But their immediate way of trying to handle it is like, well, I need to empower. See, I need to be the shaman that I really am, or the level 10 healer that I really am, or I need to start the business, or like that. And some people are really destined for that kind of thing, sure, but most people aren't. It's like there's not a lot of people in North America. There was a survey, I think, that said there's about 10,000 full-time professional astrologers in North America, something like that. It's like not a lot of people are actually able to do something full-time that's like totally spiritual in nature. It's not easy making a living doing that kind of thing. So not that I'm not trying to be cynical, right? But just the reality of what the New Age feeds us. You can be anything and do anything, and that's tantamount to being your spiritual self. Well, no, it's not. Not always, right? In most of the time, being your spiritual self is about locating your sense of dignity and beauty in who you are, regardless of what you are or what you do. And that, for many, many people, is painful. It's not. That's why, for example, C.S. Lewis so brilliantly in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe had Aslan, a lion, portraying, we're talking about Leo, the lion, portraying a Christ-like figure who's like all-powerful. But the essence of his power in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is that he is sacrificial, and he is a servant, and he's willing to die. Now, that is an extreme. We're not being asked to die, right? But to die to the ego's demands for power in this world is the beginning of where that effulgent glow, the real lion's mane, starts growing in around us. Because most of the time in literature, for example, when I was in graduate school, studied a lot of literature, one of the things that they teach you in writing classes when you're studying fiction and novel writing and stuff like that is make your character sympathetic. In other words, we should be able to understand on some level the plight of a character. The character, stories about great heroism are the stuff of pulp fiction. You know what I mean? Pulp romance novels that end happily or that have the same cyclical, predictive, but award-winning, compelling stories feature sympathetic characters. I watched a movie last night. Very rarely ever get to watch a movie. It was called The Rider. And it was about a young man who had a brain injury from an accident in a rodeo. He was like a rodeo horseback rider. And the rest of the film was about him coping with and coming to terms with life beyond the rodeo. And there was so little that had to be said for you to feel what this actor was going through. It was a really remarkable performance. If you ever saw Brokeback Mountain with Heath Ledger, it was reminiscent of his performance in that movie. But anyway, I could feel his defeat, and his suffering and his self-doubt and his pain and simple choices that he made that were not heroic, that were not big, were where in the film you could start to see his pride returning, because he wasn't going to be able to really be a rodeo rider again. I'm not ruining anything if you see this as the first 5 minutes of the movie. But he has to figure out, where does his pride come from, right? And the effulgent leonic mane grows around him in the film through his pain, through his ability to tolerate his limitations. Now, that's where it really comes from. The sign of the lion occurs at a time of year when the sun is going down in the sky every day, but it's the middle of summer. So death is an intimate part of what Leos deal with. The real effulgence of the lion comes from the lion's willingness to die, to be a part of the eventual decline. The succession of the throne will eventually come. This ego, whatever you do with it, does not matter, because in the end of the day, it will die, right? So, and I mean, it does matter, but you get what I'm saying. It doesn't matter in the sense that thinking that that's where you're going to discover your inherent beauty, pride, esteem, etc., will mislead us. So we have to be very careful of that. So getting better at things in this world, whether that means being kinder, more compassionate, a better worker, those are all noble concerns. So I don't mean to poo-poo them. It's okay if this Leo eclipse is helping you, like some of the Leo eclipses, I developed this YouTube channel, right? Here I am. Well, you know, so Venus in Leo rules my chart. It's a Taurus rising with Venus in Leo. So here I am doing something like this. This is very much about doing something that's sort of Leonic, you could say. There's a sort of performative aspect, etc. It's okay right now for any kind of Leo, you know, situation in your life to have you saying, how can I get better at something? How can I become, you know, more uniquely myself in a more egoic, temporary, material kind of way? How can I start a new project at work? How could I get a raise? How could I get a promotion? I'm not saying there is no room for those concerns. Those concerns are important. However, remember, don't forget that they come as byproducts. They are like the flowers that grow on the tree of devotion. And we're absolutely not to get enamored by them or make them the singular focus, but rather by prioritizing the emergence of our spiritual essence in life. And there's many ways to do that, but it's cultivated through daily practice. It's not just a nice idea you come back to when you crash. Just like you're not really supposed to pray just when you're in a bad situation. That was what I was told, you know, when I was growing up. Like, talk to God all the time. Don't just get down on your knees when you're in a jam. You know what I mean? Like, have a relationship with the universe, so to speak, the divine source or whatever, at all times, because that relationship will become rewarding in many situations, not just in times where you're down and out. But similarly speaking, when the focus of our life becomes watering the tree of devotion in our hearts and letting the spirit soul in us emerge and see itself more clearly in the mirror of the mind and heart, then the natural byproduct is the inspiration to know which projects to choose, which things to do, which ways to present our gifts to the world or to share our uniqueness with others. We can't put the cart before the horse, though. So that's the message I wanted to share today. So that's what I've got for you guys. I hope that this was interesting. I'm going to take a look at some questions now, and I wish everybody a really beautiful final eclipse on Saturday. And hopefully some of the thoughts here are helpful to you as you navigate the eclipses and all of the transits happening on an inner level as well as on an outer level. So I'm going to look up through the questions and see what we've got. A lovely image, hummingbird in the pallor of the plant. Yes, yeah, it was really pretty. I tried to take a picture. It did not turn out. Swimming in life-affirming conditions, babies being born in our family, many do soon, spending more time with younger children. Yeah, totally. It was Leary. Okay, thanks, Shauna. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I couldn't remember who it was. Good point. Anything with the shelf life, part of the round of temporary replenishment. How long is the trine period? Well, it's several weeks that it'll be, you know, within a couple of degrees. It's already been in a couple of degrees for a little bit now. Victoria Anna says, would you say again what you meant about spiritual growth translated to physical, tangible results? I'm not sure I got it. You're also referring to shortcuts, and there was just a lot of information. I wasn't able to make a connection between somebody getting busted for doping and somebody, let's say, relying too much on plant medicine. Yes. So let's just put it this way. This is my opinion speaking. You don't have to agree with me, right? But what I was trying to communicate was that let's say that somebody is constantly interested in using herbs to treat something like their lack of confidence or their self-esteem or trauma from their childhood or something like that. All of which I think of as an amazing good use for herbal medicine. My wife would agree. She does this for a living, right? However, for me, what's important for that practitioner is to also recognize the sacred divine source that infuses all real medicine with the power to do any kind of healing. That's basically what I'm saying, is that you can miss the forest from the trees, that focusing too much on the technology at the cost of not having a devotional relationship to the source of the technology can be really problematic. And that's what I'm saying about what I saw in the ayahuasca world often, was that people got really fixated on the ayahuasca rather than being like, wow, thanks universe, or thanks, thanks to the divine for providing this amazing medicine. And that mentality, if it's lost, it becomes very dangerous. That's my only beef with, magic or any kind of things like that, is just personally, that's the balance I think we have to figure out how to strike. Yeah. I'm contemplating growth in terms of actions and results of growth on the physical plane. Are they a good indicator? Not necessarily. It's not a stereotyped thing, right? So sometimes if you're in your spiritual practice and you're really growing, business might do better, right? Especially if you're in a spiritual practice, a spiritual business, like astrology. Like sometimes I have noticed that when I am more aligned with my spiritual practices, that my work is more attractive to people, and hence my clientele, like my income might go up for a month or something like that. And I can see that connection. But if that becomes the goal of the spiritual practice, bad karma coming. You know what I mean? In the same way, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, those who basically pray to the demigods for different kinds of benedictions will go to the planets of the demigods. They'll get their desired results, but after a while, because it all comes from me, they'll fall away from there to make sure that they come back to the realization of where it all comes from. That's Bhagavad Gita, like sort of Bhagavad Gita 101. So I think that sometimes spiritual growth is tantamount to, you'll see offshoots of material growth coming from spiritual growth, but it's absolutely not the point. It's a potentially very it's, in fact, in the process of yogic realization, there are the development of what are called siddhis, which are like mystical powers that become offshoots of your yogic practice. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali explains these. But as they develop, the temptation to get the ego identified with being powerful comes in. And so the development of power in the material life is always a temptation on the road of spiritual development. And we have to stay very vigilant. It's not to say that the mystical powers are bad, or that plants are bad, or that ayahuasca is bad, or that this or that, whatever. But they are alluring. They are potentially alluring. That's something to keep in mind as we go, because keeping our eyes fixed on the prize is sort of where that amazing effulgence starts building, and our ability to be real servants in the world beyond power or fame or visible results that we want on some level, even if it's subtle. Those desires start to fall away more and more and more when we keep just focused. We're looking, from a yogic standpoint, we're looking to be more deeply rooted in Sat Chit Ananda. It's our nature, eternality, bliss, and knowledge, intelligence of the heart that's rooted in who you are as an eternal being, and that's ultimately very happy. So that, you have to keeping your eyes focused on the prize is very important for that, because that is said to exist in all of the saints, whether it's Mother Teresa or Saint Francis or great saints in India or all over the world have said the same thing, that it grows in spaces that are very humble, there's not, like, Mother Teresa lived in poverty. I saw her room in Calcutta when I was there. It was tiny, just a little room. She wasn't without affliction in her life, in her heart, in her mind. That's not what makes a saint. You know what I mean? It's not like, oh, I'm so glad I don't have to live with my parents anymore because I've got $100,000 job I just got. You know what I mean? Like, those are struggles that we deal with, but it's some differentiation is required. I hope that helps. How's Summer doing? She's doing great. I'm excited. After I'm done with this, I'm done for the day. So I'm just going to be spending time. Thanks, Sheila. Thanks, everyone. Glad to spend time with you guys today. All right, good. That's all the questions. So I hope that you guys all have a very blessed eclipse, and we'll see you sometime soon. Whoops. Take care, guys. Bye.